Have you ever found yourself, once again, insisting on someone who hurts you? Have you ever wondered why even after pain, absence, and rejection, something inside you still begs for crumbs of presence? In this video, we'll walk through a territory we don't always have the courage to visit, the invisible origin of our affective repetition. Let's talk about what's behind our insistence on relationships that hurt, and why, even when we're aware of the pain, we continue to stay in it. This video is a mirror. If you feel like you're always loving someone who doesn't see you, or you always go back to the same kind of relationship that drains you, stay with me until the end. The answer you seek may not be outside, but rather right inside you. Repetition that is not coincidence, the invisible emotional pattern. Have you ever noticed how certain relationships begin with the promise of something new, but end with the same old pain? The scenarios change, the names change, even the gestures seem different at first, but in the end, the feeling that remains is familiar. That mix of emptiness, frustration, and doubt. How did I get here again? This happens because often, we're not connecting with the other person. We're connecting with our own history, with unhealed wounds, with emotional patterns that were shaped long before we knew what love was. We enter into relationships as if they were opportunities for redemption. And unconsciously, we seek out unresolved versions of our emotional figures in others. Not to repeat the trauma, but to try this time to repair it. It's as if somewhere inside us, there's a wounded child waiting for things to be different now. For that abandonment to become presence. For that criticism to become acceptance. For the silence that once hurt us to become listening. But it's a painful illusion. Because while we try to heal the past using the present as a tool, life only repeats the pain with new masks. And so we cling to relationships that hurt us, believing that if we endure long enough, if we are good enough, if we love hard enough, everything will be transformed. But this silent effort often only deepens the wound. The pattern hides precisely because it seems natural, because it seems like love when, in fact, it's just a reflection of our own neediness. Healing isn't about changing the other person. It isn't about striving for acceptance. True healing begins when we have the courage to look within and recognize, this didn't start here. This pain is old. This abandonment isn't new. And I no longer need to live trying to prove my worth to deserve love. From that point on, the pattern begins to lose strength. Because what sustains the repetition is silence about the origin of the pain. The origin, when it all started without you noticing. Even before we experience our first love, we are already silently learning what it means to be kind. And this learning doesn't happen with words. Happens with gestures, absences, and glances. The way we were touched or ignored. The tone of voice with which our feelings were validated or silenced. The way our requests were heard or ignored. Each small experience builds, brick by brick, what we call an emotional bond. If you grew up hearing more criticism than praise, you may have learned that you need to earn every crumb of affection. If you learned that to be accepted, you had to not bother anyone, you may have become someone who keeps quiet to keep affection close. If love came conditioned on good behavior, performance, obedience, then for you, love and approval became synonymous. This wounded child didn't disappear with time, it grew inside you. It wears its adult clothes, but it still carries the same fears. And this child will seek, in future relationships, the continuation of the patterns it learned, loving those who are emotionally distant, begging for attention, fighting to be seen. Not out of masochism, but because it's familiar. It's what it understands as love. But there is a decisive moment, the moment you recognize that you are no longer that child. That today, you can offer yourself what was once denied to you. You can be the shoulder that was missing, the gaze that welcomes, the boundary that protects. This turning point doesn't come with grand events. It comes in the silence of a choice, not to repeat what hurt, just because that's what you learned. Because now, you have the chance to rewrite history starting from within. Why do we still desire those who hurt us? The answer no one wants to hear it. May seem absurd to desire someone who hurts us. But emotionally, this logic makes sense, especially when we grew up learning that love and pain go hand in hand. When affection always came with tension, when care was fickle and presence was unpredictable, our bodies learned that intensity equals love, that absence is proof of depth, that jealousy is caring, that suffering is romanticism. This is the basis of many bonds that destroy us and yet bind us. We call this traumatic bonding. It's when the same hand that offers affection also pulls the trigger of pain. It's when rejection becomes a form of closeness, because neediness activates our instinct for conquest. And we believe, even without realizing it, that we need to deserve love, as if being loved were a prize and not a right. The more we're hurt, the more we try to prove our worth. We insist, justify, endure. We become experts at accepting little and calling it love. Because deep down, we're trying to change the ending of a story that began long before the person by our side. The pain isn't just in the absence of the other person. It's in the absence we feel within ourselves, which we try to fill with the wrong presence. But there comes a point when you need to ask the question that changes everything. Why do I keep running after someone who always runs from me? And more importantly, what in me still believes it needs to be hurt to be loved? This answer doesn't come lightly, but it comes with freedom, because it teaches you that you no longer need to repeat what broke you. And that, yes, there is love that embraces, love that endures, love that doesn't bleed. You only begin to experience this kind of love when you understand that it begins within you, and that the other person can only offer you what you've already decided not to deny yourself anymore. The illusion of change. When hope gets sick, one of the hardest emotional addictions to break is the belief that if you love enough, the other person will change. That if you're patient, understanding, generous, they'll finally wake up and recognize everything you've done. This hope, at first, seems like strength, but over time, it becomes unhealthy. It becomes an emotional addiction. And all hope that depends on the other person's transformation one day becomes chronic frustration. You mold yourself, adapt, silence your pain to maintain harmony. You go beyond what you can, trying to prove that it's possible to love even that which hurts. But love doesn't have that power, because change isn't a gift you receive after persistence. It's an internal decision driven by conscience, not guilt or fear of loss. Those who change for others change only briefly, but those who change for themselves change for real. But those who love too much often confuse persistence with loyalty, and they end up staying where only promises exist, feeding and almost living on exceptions, hoping the other person will return to who they were in the early days. But the early days were a facade, and you know it. Hope then becomes anesthesia. You stop feeling how much it hurts, and start fantasizing about what could be if everything were different. But what's holding you back isn't love, it's the illusion of reparation. You're not trying to save someone else. You're trying to save yourself from the pain of feeling disposable. You're hoping that, at the end of all that effort, someone will look at you and say, "You're worth it." But that statement needs to come from within. Only when you recognize your own worth will you stop begging for recognition in hands that have always been empty. Self-abandonment. The silent betrayal that hurts. The most self-abandonment doesn't happen on a single day. There's no flash, no timeline, no clearly defined before and after. What there is an accumulation. A subtle, almost imperceptible sequence of small renunciations. First, you stop expressing your feelings to avoid conflict. Then, you begin to swallow discomfort to preserve peace. Next, you silence your dreams. Distance yourself from the people who reminded you of who you were, and begin acting according to what others expect. Before you know it, you've already dissolved in your attempt to be accepted. It's a process that masquerades as love but tastes like absence, because self-abandonment comes with a distorted idea that loving another requires forgetting yourself. It comes with a silent belief, ingrained from an early age, that those who love endure, give in, understand everything. And so you start making concessions no one asked for, but that you believed were necessary to avoid being left behind. This betrayal is the cruelest because it happens in secret, inside you. And the scariest part, it happens with your consent. You sign invisible emotional agreements. I won't complain if he stays here. I won't say what I think if she keeps choosing me. And so, you begin to bargain your own truth for crumbs of presence. The problem is that eventually, the body takes its toll. The sparkle fades from the eyes. Energy weighs heavily. Anxiety increases. The feeling of suffocation appears even on the lightest days, because there's a cost to erasing yourself so much. A high cost. The silence begins to scream from within, and the mirror becomes a difficult place to look, not out of vanity, but because the reflected image no longer represents your essence. And the hardest part of all is when you realize no one ripped you away. No one invaded your story and took you away. It was you who kept putting yourself off. You who kept shrinking your contours to fit into spaces that were too tight. And that hurts, but it also frees. Because by taking responsibility, you reclaim. Your power. Self-abandonment isn't cured with empty promises or vows that next time will be different. It's cured with conscious action, with small daily choices where you return to yourself, where you listen to yourself even if your voice trembles, where you embrace yourself even if guilt tries to sabotage you, where you learn to stay for yourself. It's not an easy path, because it involves losing people who only knew how to love your submissive self. It involves enduring the discomfort of saying no. It involves facing the fear of emptiness. But this emptiness, as frightening as it may seem, is fertile, because it's in it that you plant the seeds of your reunion. And finding yourself again isn't about going back to who you were before. It's about becoming who you needed to abandon. It's about rebuilding a relationship with your own presence. It's about becoming your own home. And that's the most revolutionary love there is. The one you offer yourself, without conditions, without guilt, without fear. The morning of idealized love. When the end begins before the end, the most painful. Ending isn't the one that ends with words. It's the one that ends in silence. It's the one that dies inside, even while on the outside, everything seems the same. The smile remains on the face, the commitments continue, the dinners happen, but the heart is no longer there. Because there's a kind of ending that isn't made with goodbyes, but with accumulated absences. This is the morning of idealized love, the morning for the story you created within yourself. Not for what the relationship actually was, but for what you hoped it would become. You mourn not just the end of the bond, but the end of the dream. The inner promise that if you loved enough, if you were patient, understanding, strong, that love would finally blossom. But flowers don't grow in the desert. And no matter how much you watered with presence, dedication, and hope, the other person's soil may never have been fertile. The hardest truth is realizing that the love you felt was real, but perhaps the relationship never was. It existed more within you than outside. And when that happens, the grief is twofold. You have to let go of the person and the fantasy, the face you loved, and the story you projected. And it shatters. Because by letting go of the ideal, you also let go of the part of you that believed you could save it, that insisted, with all your might, on making something. Work that only existed in your innermost imagination. The pain of this kind of grief is profound because it's invisible. You're still in the relationship, but you're already experiencing a lonely goodbye. You sleep next to the person and, at the same time, feel like no one is there. And when you try to explain this pain to someone, it has no name because the love hasn't officially ended yet. It's just faded within. But acknowledging this is an act of emotional courage, because the human heart is a master at clinging to what could have been. We're experts at hoping for a maybe that costs us the now. And in this clinging to possibility, we sacrifice our truth. We hold on to relationships that are long gone, simply because we haven't yet had the courage to let go. What you need to understand is that acceptance isn't giving up. It's emotional maturity. It's the wisdom to realize that life isn't built on idealizations. That love isn't lived through effort alone. That connection isn't one-sided. And that presence without reciprocity is accompanied loneliness. Honoring this grief is essential. Not to wallow in pain, but to respect what you felt. Your surrender was real. Your hope was beautiful. Your heart loved intensely. And all of this deserves to be recognized, yes. It just doesn't need to be maintained any longer. You don't need to keep trying to save a story that, in practice, only exists within you. Allow yourself to feel the pain without rushing to heal, without fear of crying. Because this is the beginning of mourning, but also of liberation. It is there, in that empty space left by the end, that something new can be born. Not outside, but inside. A more lucid version of you, more whole, freer to love without losing yourself, reconnecting with your truth. The turning point sometimes, awakening doesn't come like a bang. It comes like a whisper, a slight but persistent discomfort. A silent discomfort when you look in the mirror and no longer recognize yourself. A longing for yourself you didn't know existed. And it's in this silence, between a silent tear and an exhaustion that can no longer be disguised, that you hear something you'd forgotten. Your truth calling to you. It's not an immediate certainty. It's a spark, a vague memory of what made your heart flutter before you began molding yourself to fit in. A simple but symbolic gesture, refusing what you once accepted without thinking, saying no and feeling relief instead of guilt, choosing your own well-being even while trembling inside, and realizing with surprise that the world didn't end because of it, but something inside you began to be reborn. This is the turning point, the moment you stop bargaining with yourself, when the fear of being alone is less than the fear of continuing to betray yourself. When even though you still feel love, you understand that no love is worth its absence. When you look at everything you've endured, and for the first time, say, enough. I deserve more. Not out of pride, but out of emotional dignity. Reconnecting with your own truth doesn't happen all at once. It happens through daily, silent, and sometimes invisible choices. It arises the moment you begin to treat yourself as precious. When you sit with your pain, listen without judgment, and promise yourself, I will never abandon myself again. When you exchange the need to please for the desire to be true to your essence. And then, everything begins to reorganize itself within. Your truth may be uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to confront what you've pushed aside. What you've endured in silence, what you've pretended not to see. But it's also the only place where emotional freedom flourishes, where love stops being an effort and becomes an encounter, where you understand that relationships shouldn't hurt you to make you grow, but rather embrace you as you grow on your own. This turning point is sacred because it is where you become your own again. And from there, every relationship transforms or ends, but nothing stays the same. Because you are no longer willing to fit into spaces that require your emotional mutilation. You no longer want to survive love. You want to inhabit love with presence, with respect, with wholeness, and that changes everything. Because the world treats differently those who have learned to treat themselves truthfully. Internal activation, the power to decide not to abandon yourself anymore. There comes a moment when something inside you changes, and it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's silent, but non-negotiable. A strength that doesn't come from anger, nor from pride. It comes from exhaustion, from realizing you've given too much, that you've given enough, that there's nothing left of you left to sacrifice in the name of a love that never arrived whole. This inner activation is a kind of rebirth, not like someone returning to their former self, but like someone finally giving life to something that's always been dormant. It's not about promising to be strong. It's about no longer allowing yourself to be absent. It's when you no longer fight to be loved, because you understand that true love begins when you refuse to keep putting yourself off. And it's not grand gestures that define this turning point. It's details. It's when you read that message and, instead of rushing to respond, you take a deep breath and remember what you felt the last time. It's when someone invites you to make another concession disguised as affection ... and you decline, not out of pride, but out of loyalty to yourself. It's when you hear a veiled criticism, and instead of justifying yourself, you stand up silently and leave. It's in these small no's that your new emotional identity is born. Little by little, you begin to understand it's not about protecting yourself from others. It's about protecting yourself, from the old version of you who accepted. Little, who sacrificed yourself to be chosen, who molded yourself to avoid being left behind. You begin to see yourself more clearly. And with that, you begin to attract different relationships. Not because the world has changed, but because your frequency has changed. Because you no longer accept half-heartedness. Because you've learned to offer yourself whole. This is the moment when self-love stops being a catchphrase and becomes a yardstick. It becomes a shield. It becomes a compass. It becomes new ground where before there were only holes. And know this doesn't mean closing yourself off to love. It means opening yourself only to the love that recognizes your wholeness. That meets you where you already are and doesn't try to move you to fit into spaces too tight for your soul. When you decide to stop abandoning yourself, everything changes. Not because the pain disappears, but because you stop letting it dictate your path. You belong to yourself again. You prioritize yourself again. And you understand, once and for all, that no one can offer you what you continue to deny yourself. This is true self-love, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, that doesn't negotiate essence, that doesn't sacrifice itself to please, which, contrary to what many say, isn't arrogance, it's emotional survival. It's effective maturity. It's the courage to live relationships where you remain whole, or choose not to. If this video touched you, it's because a part of you is ready for a change. So don't let it die. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications here. We talk about love, but without romanticizing pain. About reunions, but without depending on the other person to come back to you. Like the video if it helped you. And share it with anyone you feel needs to hear it too. Sometimes a single word saves someone's day or their life. And save it to watch later, when silence becomes a prison. How to know if you are nullifying yourself for love. An even deeper dive into the dynamics of self-abandonment and how to reverse this cycle before it destroys who you are.